Hello, friends, and happy first day of autumn. Welcome to another installment of Golondrinas Live Sessions. I'm Laura Gonzalez, the Education and Volunteer Manager here at El Rancho de las Golondrinas Living History Museum. We're located just south of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the beautiful and historic La Cienega Valley. Joining me today is internationally recognized communications lawyer, author, speaker, conference leader, and El Rancho de las Golondrinas board member, Henry Rivera. He is a former commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission and has been named one of the District of Columbia's super lawyers. Mr. Rivera is among the best lawyers in America in communications law and among the top 12 telecom experts in the U.S. He is a partner in the Washington, D.C. firm of Wiley Ryan and a native New Mexican who obtained both his BA and JD from the University of New Mexico. He has a passion for history, particularly the U.S. Civil War, and is a member of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. His topic today is Bernardo de Galvez, honorary U.S. citizen, and Spain's contribution to the American Revolution. So please join me in welcoming Henry Rivera. And if at any time during this presentation you have questions, go ahead and put those into the comments, and we'll get to those at the end of the talk. Henry, welcome.
Thank you, Laura, for that very nice introduction. And I just want to add my welcome to Laura's to this talk, and thank you for attending. As Laura mentioned, we're coming to you directly from the ranch. And if you haven't been to the ranch during the fall, it's the most beautiful time of year, in my opinion, to be here. So come out and visit us. You can get your tickets on the website. And again, it's a beautiful time of year to be here. From time to time, you will be hearing me talk to our great producer, Vic, about changing the slides, which is what I'm about to do. So Vic, would you give us the first slide? I first became interested in the fellow whose portrait is before you when I heard a talk by my fellow Golondrinas board member, Tom Chavez. He's a very remarkable fellow. The next slide, please. On December 16, 2014, President Obama signed a joint resolution of Congress making Bernardo de Galvez an honorary citizen of the United States. As you may be aware, this is the highest honor the U.S. government can bestow on a foreign citizen, and one that has been granted only 8 times. To give you a sense of how elite and august this small group is, Winston Churchill is also an honorary citizen of the United States. The joint resolution of Congress states Bernardo was a hero of the Revolutionary War who risked his life for the freedom of the United States people, and his victories against the British were recognized by George Washington as a deciding factor in the outcome of the Revolutionary War. The joint resolution goes on to say the United States Continental Congress declared on October 31, 1778, their gratitude and favorable sentiments to Bernardo for his conduct toward the United States because he played an integral role in the Revolutionary War and helped secure the independence of the United States. Several geographic locations in and around the United States, including Galveston Bay, Galveston, Texas, Galveston County, Texas, Galvez, Louisiana, and St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, are all named for him. But he and the role he played in the Revolutionary War are almost unknown. Prior to working on this paper, I knew very little about him. Moreover, like myself, I assume most are woefully ignorant of the significant role Spain played in our War of Independence. Next slide, please. It's also all but forgotten that our War of Independence was merely a theater of a global war, with Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic aligned against Great Britain. Battles were fought on 3 continents, in such places as St. Eustatius, Saba, and St. Martin, all in the Caribbean, and Pondicherry, Cuddalore, and the Bay of Bengal, all in India, and Bermuda, Minorca, Gibraltar, and Guatemala. While Spain did elect to involve itself in our Revolutionary War, involve itself? Simply put, its involvement was premised on pursuing its own foreign policy interests. It preferred to share North America, a new small republic with a weak central government, as opposed to sharing it with Great Britain. The context for this World War is supplied by the 1759 Seven Years' War between Spain and Britain that preceded it. The 7 Years' War ended in the 1763 Treaty of Paris, which provided that Spain would lose Florida to Britain, but gain Louisiana from France. French Louisiana was a territory of 828,000 square miles, stretching from the west bank of the Mississippi to the Continental Divide, and included New Orleans. In 1800, Spain returned Louisiana to France, which in turn sold it to the United States in 1803. This, of course, was the famous Louisiana Purchase. Next slide, please. Spain's imperial policy considerations caused it to seek the following four strategic objectives. First, revenge against Britain for Spain's defeat in the 7 Years' War. Second, pursuit of its traditional confrontation with Britain in the Americas by driving the British out of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico and the east bank of the Mississippi. Third, weaken the British Empire in general. And four, recover specific territories, especially Gibraltar and Minorca. By 1783, all these objectives were achieved, except for obtaining Gibraltar. Helping to America to achieve its independence from Britain was not among Spain's strategic objectives. Therefore, Spain never considered the United States an ally, and much of its financial and material aid supporting the American Revolution was covert, particularly the aid furnished to America prior to Spain's declaration of war on Britain. Nevertheless, there is no question but that Spain's entry into the Revolutionary War tipped the balance decidedly against the British and toward the American rebels. Next slide, please. Bernardo's initial role in our War of Independence was to channel most of Spain's covert aid to the insurgents in the United States. After Spain declared war on Britain, he led Spanish troops against British redcoats along the Mississippi River and at Mobile and Pensacola. These actions were a significant help to Americans because they diverted British military and naval forces from concentrating exclusively on Washington's Continental Army, thus making a huge difference in the American rebels' chances of succeeding in their quest for independence. Next slide, please. Spain also contributed significant economic aid to America's fight against Great Britain, which totaled approximately $2 billion in today's dollars. Spain also opened its Caribbean ports to American trade, which was essential both for the new American nation to sustain its military effort and for the American Navy, which was able to use these Spanish ports for safe docking, to rest its crews, refit and reprovision its ships. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Turning to the man himself, Bernardo was born on July 23rd, 1746, in northern Spain. His family were shepherds and not nobility, so they were of limited social status. While his father was an army officer, he had few friends in the top echelons of the army. However, his uncle, José de Galvez, made himself indispensable to the Viceroy of New Spain and was able to significantly influence his nephew's career. José's very interesting career is worthy of its own paper, but our focus here is on his nephew, Bernardo. On July 12, 1762, José, through his connections at the French embassy in Madrid, secured a commission as a lieutenant in the French army for Bernardo. The Bourbons of France were allied with the Bourbons of Spain against Britain, and it was not uncommon for Spanish soldiers to begin their military careers in the French army. Bernardo was 16 at the time he received his lieutenant's commission. Next slide, please. In 1769, Bernardo arrived in New Spain, and at the age of 23 received a captain's commission. He was posted to the Presidio in Chihuahua in April 1769 and was part of an expedition to Nueva Vizcaya against the Apaches. Nueva Vizcaya was in the northern part of New Spain and is today Mexico's states of Durango and Chihuahua. Bernardo learned much fighting the Apache that would be useful to him in the future, both when fighting the British in Louisiana and Florida and when he returned to New Spain as viceroy. He was wounded during the expedition and developed the reputation of being fearless. Bernardo returned to Spain in 1772 and joined an infantry regiment as a captain at the age of 26. He left the regiment in 1774 due to an appointment to the Royal Military Academy of Avila, which was created to instruct young officers who showed great promise in the hope of developing a cadre of young scientifically oriented officers who would help found a new model army for Spain. Next slide, please. In 1775, Bernardo joined a Spanish military expedition against Algiers. He was given command of a light infantry company. The light infantry acted as skirmishers, gathering intelligence for the main body of infantry. Bernardo was well suited to this type of fighting due to his combat experience against the Apaches. Bernardo was wounded in the leg in Algiers and distinguished himself by staying with his troops despite his wound until ordered to leave the field. His gallant service did not go unnoticed. The expedition was a disaster for Spain, but garnered Bernardo a promotion to lieutenant colonel and command of a grenadier company in early 1776. At the age of 29, with only 13 and a half years of active duty, Bernardo was a lieutenant colonel when the average age of a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish army was 50. Next slide, please. Moreover, a few months later, Bernardo was appointed colonel of an infantry regiment in Louisiana and governor of Louisiana. His knowledge of the French language and the French, as well as his experience in New Spain, were cited as reasons for his appointment. Of course, it did not hurt that his uncle Jose had been appointed the all-powerful minister of the Indies in late 1775, and as such had the king's ear, and became the chief administrator of Spain's New World colonies. Bernardo's career had taken off in a big way. Bernardo arrived in Louisiana at the end of 1776 at the age of 30, when our Revolutionary War was not going so well. In August of 1776, 30,000 redcoats and a powerful British fleet landed in New York and quickly conquered it to provide the British with a base of operations to use against the American rebels. Next slide, please. Bernardo began to prepare for war against the British upon his arrival in New Orleans by raising troops and creating and supervising a spy network to gather intelligence about the British military in Florida. These preparations would serve him well when Spain declared war on Britain, which occurred on June 21, 1779. I was surprised to learn that this war impacted our New Mexico ancestors, as the king demanded that all his subjects shoulder the economic burden of paying for the war. The famous Juan Bautista de Anza was governor of New Mexico at the time and was charged with securing this contribution from the king's New Mexico subjects. All free subjects of European ancestry were required to contribute 2 pesos. Castas, people of mixed race, were required to donate 1 peso. New Mexico Indians were required to donate 1 peso. But Anza requested that the Zunis, Pecos, and Hopis be exempted because of their extreme poverty, which request was approved. New Mexico's contribution totaled 3,677 pesos, of which 233 pesos existed in the form of seed. The king was grateful to his New Mexico subjects and issued a royal edict, which Anza dutifully posted throughout the colony, that extended the king's official gratitude to all Nuevo Mexicanos who had shared their bounty for the defense of New Spain. I'm sure this decree must have been viewed by New Mexicans with some irony, for they were well aware that the king had taken their money for a war that seemed very, very far from New Mexico. Next slide, please. A month prior to Spain's declaration of war against Britain, Spain informed its officials in America that the declaration was imminent. Bernardo did not wait for the official declaration before initiating plans to attack the British, which he intended to do on August 22, 1779. However, on August 18, a hurricane struck and sunk all his ships. His supplies were lost. Nevertheless, Bernardo was resolved to attack the British. His thinking was, if before the hurricane the British did not believe that the Spaniards would attack, now, because of the destruction caused by the hurricane, which did not affect British settlements, they would certainly believe that the Spanish were incapable of an attack. Thus, Bernardo reasoned it was the perfect opportunity for a surprise attack. But Bernardo needed the support of the local population in order to carry off such an attack, which he secured with a very emotional speech, causing the local people to salvage anything that had survived the hurricane in order to provide Bernardo with the means to wage war on the British. 4 small ships were removed from the river bottom, repaired, armed with cannon, and provisioned. On August 27th, Bernardo and his small force moved against Fort Manchac on the left bank of the Mississippi, south of Baton Rouge. A few American volunteers were among his force. The fort was captured. It was a small affair, with no casualties on either side, but it was important for Bernardo, who used it as a way to build confidence in his heretofore untried and untrained army. His army then moved against the English fort at Baton Rouge, which was a much more daunting affair than the one at Fort Manchac. Baton Rouge was defended by 900 men, 400 of whom were veterans, 13 cannons, a moat, and earthen walls. Bernardo had about 951 men, of whom 170 were veterans, but he had 10 cannons of larger caliber than the English, which meant that they were of longer range than the English guns. As a result of Bernardo's superior tactics, the English were forced to surrender. Between 577 and 485 British prisoners were taken, and the English suffered 36 dead and 10 wounded. Bernardo forced the surrendering redcoats to become prisoners of war, and to surrender not only Baton Rouge, but Natchez as well. Thus Spain obtained 2 significant English settlements on the Mississippi, but had to attack only one. Including Natchez in the surrender terms of Baton Rouge is regarded as a masterstroke by Bernardo. Next slide, please. While Bernardo was busy conquering British forts along the Mississippi, the American corvette Morris and the British ship West Florida fought on Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans. This resulted in the Americans capturing the West Florida, which was a much larger and better armed vessel than the Morris. The importance of this action is that the West Florida became part of the Spanish Navy under the new name Galveston, and it would play a significant role in Bernardo's future campaign against the British. We will return to the importance of the Galveston in a moment. From America's point of view, Bernardo's achievements during the campaign dispersed British forces that could have united against the American Army. It also helped to relieve pressure against Georgia and South Carolina. It made it impossible for the two British armies operating in the North and South to unite. Finally, it ensured that Spanish aid to America could reach General Washington via the Mississippi, which was now a Spanish river. Following this very successful expedition, Bernardo's uncle, Jose, assured Bernardo was promoted to brigadier general, affirming Bernardo's position as the supreme commander of all military operations in Spain's North American theater. It was good to have family in high places. Next slide, please. Some Americans were displeased by the Spanish conquests on the Mississippi because, of course, those acquisitions by Spain could no longer be incorporated into the new United States, nor could the United States freely navigate the Mississippi because it was now a Spanish river. This was an important issue for the Continental Congress, but one which they were powerless to do anything about. Next slide, please. Bernardo's next task was the conquest of Mobile and Pensacola, which he correctly felt were the keys to the conquest of the Gulf of Mexico. Mobile was first on Bernardo's agenda. Mobile's Fort Charlotte was defended by between 100 and 300 British soldiers, while Spain's attacking force numbered 1,300. Therefore, the garrison's only hope was to hold on until reinforcements from Pensacola could reach them. Bernardo asked the British commander to surrender, but he refused, whereupon Bernardo initiated the siege of Fort Charlotte. The fort fell on March 12th after a day-long exchange of artillery fire resulted in a breach of the fort's walls. 1,100 British reinforcements were indeed on their way from Pensacola, but failed to reach the fort before the British surrendered. Pensacola was next on Bernardo's agenda. However, Pensacola was too strong, and Bernardo could not proceed to attack Pensacola absent reinforcements from Havana. Such reinforcements were not forthcoming due to the fact that despite direct orders from the king to support Bernardo's Pensacola expedition, Cuba's governor was dragging his feet. The governor and highly placed military men were jealous of Bernardo's success and his meteoric rise in the eyes of the king, and they didn't want to help him. Therefore, they delayed. Bernardo went to Havana personally to convince the governor and the Navy to support his efforts. He was successful, and the expedition was ready to embark when a hurricane devastated and scattered the force to such an extent that the expedition had to be canceled. Well, Bernardo returned to Havana in an attempt to revitalize the project, but he met with the same resistance. Next slide, please. Now, to counter this resistance, Bernardo resorted to subterfuge. Instead of asking for troops and transports to attack Pensacola, he asked for troops and transports to carry those troops to reinforce the garrisons at New Orleans and Mobile, in order to defend those places Spain had already taken from the British. He believed that reinforcing those locations to protect what Spain now possessed was an easier sell than mounting a new expedition to take Pensacola. But he never intended for these troops to go to New Orleans or Mobile. Instead, he would lead them directly to Pensacola. Finally, after much effort by Bernardo and his allies, the expedition for the relief of Mobile and the conquest of Pensacola set sail for Havana. With 5 warships, 27 transports, and more than 1,500 soldiers. Bernardo went directly to Santa Rosa Island, which lies at the entrance to Pensacola Bay, and despite a small British contingent on the island, occupied it and placed an artillery battery there. Next slide, please. Bernardo next had to land troops on the mainland in order to initiate the siege. However, he needed the Navy's help to do that. That help was not forthcoming because the Navy commander thought the British defenses were too strong. Bernardo's authority to command the Navy was murky, such that the senior Navy officer felt comfortable disobeying Bernardo's order to enter the bay on the basis that his prime directive was to protect the fleet. Fortunately for Bernardo, the Galveston, you will remember the Galveston from the fight on Lake Pontchartrain, was under his direct command and not the command of the Navy. He boarded the Galveston and with other 2 ships entered the bay and anchored. Seeing his success, the rest of the fleet, including the troop transports, entered the bay the following day. The reason these ships were able to pass safely into the bay is that the British cannons at the mouth of the bay were positioned such that they could not be depressed sufficiently to hit the Spanish ships as they entered the bay. Therefore, despite more than 140 rounds fired at the Spanish fleet, all of the ships entered the bay undamaged. This put Bernardo and his force of 1,500 men in a position to disembark onto the mainland to begin the siege. Next slide, please. When Bernardo succeeded in forcing entry to the bay, he addressed his men, saying, "I, my sons, went alone to sacrifice myself so as not to expose a single soldier, not a man of the army, so that the Navy could see that there is no danger." This is the origin of his famous motto, "Yo solo," which historians have used extensively in reference to Bernardo. Years later, the king would add "Yo solo" to Bernardo's coat of arms. It should be noted that Bernardo was perfectly aware that he did not force the entry to the Pensacola Bay by himself, and that he had the crews of the 3 ships he commanded to thank for his success, which he did publicly. Next slide, please. The 1,900 British troops defending Pensacola were of poor condition and low morale, clearly not the flower of the British Army. Moreover, the defense of Pensacola was hobbled by the fact that the civilian governor and the military commander did not collaborate or communicate well. The 2 sides exchanged artillery fire, but on May 8, artillery caused a huge explosion in the main redoubt, and Bernardo ordered his troops to attack, which resulted in the fall of the redoubt. With the redoubt in Spanish hands, Pensacola could not survive.
6 hours later,
and 6 hours later,
hoisted
the white flag. Subsequently, the British agreed to articles of capitulation, which prohibited British POWs from further action against Spain or its allies. Total British casualties were 90 dead, 46 wounded, 1,113 taken prisoner. The British also lost many significant military supplies. It was not a good day for the British. The prisoners were taken to Cuba, but shortly after arriving there set sail for New York. Spanish casualties were 74 dead and 198 wounded. Next slide, please. Now, despite Spain's success against the British at Pensacola, Americans were not pleased about that part of the Articles of Capitulation which precluded British POWs from further action against Spain or its allies. Because Spain and America were not formally allied, those British POWs returning to New York from Pensacola, and there were about 1,000 of them, were sent to reinforce British positions there. Samuel Harrington, president of the Continental Congress, said in a July 1781 letter to George Washington, "I cannot persuade myself that Governor Galvez, who commanded the expedition and who manifested the most friendly sentiments and attachments for us, would admit of such terms so apparently detrimental to these states." While on its face, Americans' views were correct, as noted above, among the strategic objectives decided by King Carlos III were to expel the British from the Gulf Coast's northern rim and the lower Mississippi. Bernardo accomplished that with the fall of Pensacola, and the generous terms he gave the British at Pensacola were intended to permit Bernardo to avoid a prolonged fight there so that he could initiate preparations to attack Jamaica. While this may not have resulted in aims of the American rebels, Bernardo's conduct was intended to, and did in fact, further Spain's foreign policy interests. Significantly, for the Americans, Spain's acquisition of West Florida from the British blocked American access to the Caribbean, and Spain's victory at Pensacola meant that the war in that theater was over, meaning that the British could now focus on its war with America. Neither was welcome news in the new United States. One U.S. politician noted, "The success of the Spaniards at Pensacola will be more prejudicial to our operations than their failure would have been." Next slide, please. The victory at Pensacola was a very big deal for Spain, and it caused Bernardo to be named Spain's supreme commander in all military operations in the Gulf region. All the commanders in Havana who had dragged their feet in supporting Bernardo's efforts against Pensacola were removed. And the king promoted Bernardo to the rank of lieutenant general, the highest in the Spanish army at the time. He was 35 and the youngest lieutenant general in the Spanish army and the second youngest to ever attain this rank. The king also decreed that the Great Bay of Pensacola bear the name Santa Maria de Galvez Bay, in memory of the conqueror who claimed it for the crown. 2 years after the conquest of Pensacola, Bernardo was awarded the title of Count of Galvez and Viscount of Galveston. Bernardo thereby became part of the Spanish titled aristocracy, which was not only a success for Bernardo, but for his entire family. The Galvez clan was at its height. Bernardo's father, Matias, was Viceroy of New Spain. His uncle Jose was Minister of the Indies and would be made Marquis of Sonora in 2 years. And Bernardo was a Lieutenant General and a Count. Next slide, please. Not one to rest on his laurels, in August of 1781, Bernardo returned to Cuba to begin planning the invasion of Jamaica. This was consistent with Spanish foreign policy objectives to expel the British from the Gulf of Mexico. However, Jamaica would be a harder nut to crack than Pensacola because Port Royal had been a British possession for more than 100 years, had impressive defenses, and a sizable and well-supplied garrison. Bernardo believed he would need at least 20,000 troops and a fleet of more than 30 ships of the line with substantial help from the British fleet and army to topple Jamaica. Such an expedition would also require a great deal of money. Despite his best efforts, Bernardo was unable to raise sufficient troops or ships for the expedition in 1781, and he postponed it. Before Bernardo could gather the necessary resources for the Jamaica expedition, the war ended. The treaty was signed in September of 1783, which caused Bernardo to abandon his plans for the expedition. Next slide, please. After the treaty ending the war was signed, three issues remained between Spain and the United States: free navigation of the Mississippi, repayment of the substantial loans made by Spain to the United States to finance the revolution, and Florida's border. France, Spain, and the United States each had a different view of where this border should be. Free navigation of the Mississippi by the United States was finally granted by treaty in 1795. Repayment of the loans was settled in 1793, and Florida's border was settled by the September 1783 Treaty of Paris between Britain and the United States. Since the U.S. and Spain were not formally allied in the war against Britain, the U.S. determined it could treat with Britain directly and need not resolve or notify Spain about this border issue. Next slide, please. The king ordered Bernardo to return to Spain and present himself at court, where in January 1784, the king appointed him supreme military commander of Florida and Louisiana, which was a huge territory from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean, plus Florida and the southern parts of Alabama and Mississippi. 6 months later, he was also appointed the supreme military commander of Cuba. In other words, Bernardo was now the supreme authority over all Spanish territory in North and Central America and the Caribbean, and also became the Inspector General of the Spanish troops in America. Following these appointments, Bernardo set sail for Cuba in late 1784. In January of 1785, he was ordered to move to New Spain to become the acting viceroy. His father Matias was the viceroy of New Spain, but was ill, and the king wanted Bernardo to act for Matias until he got well. Next slide. Bernardo's link to the American Revolution ends with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, but his story goes on for a few years as viceroy of New Spain. As viceroy, he touched New Mexico again in August of 1785, ordering the famous Governor Anza to provide him a comprehensive report regarding the colony's state of affairs. He also reorganized New Mexico's governing structure. Since the focus of this paper is why Bernardo is a hero of the American Revolution, I will not go into his time as viceroy, other than to say that he initiated many reforms, including the Americanizing the Spanish military in New Spain, and was an extremely popular viceroy. In sum, it was a highly successful chapter in his life. He contracted amoebic dysentery at the age of 40, he died in Tacubaya, Mexico, on November 30, 1786. He's buried in Mexico City and was survived by his wife and 3 children, one of whom was born after his death. He was a man of many accomplishments in his all too brief 40 years, and while his contributions to the American Revolution were focused on furthering Spain's foreign policy interests, the American rebels were fortunate to have had common cause with Bernardo, honorary United States citizen and hero of the American Revolution. If you'd like to know more about this remarkable fellow and Spain's role in our War of Independence, I invite your attention to Bernardo de Galvez, Spanish Hero of the American Revolution by Gonzalo Quintero Saravia, and Spain and the Independence of the United States, an Intrinsic Gift by my fellow board member, Tom Chavez. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Henry. We've got a few questions here for you.
Okay.
You mentioned that New Mexico citizens, because at that time New Mexico was part of Spain, that Spain required them to pay tributes for the war. How did New Mexicans generally feel about that? Were they bitter about that? Was there any upheaval about that?
If they were bitter about it, well, first of all, I think nobody likes to pay taxes, and this was an unexpected tax. So there were probably some folks who were bitter about it, but as I mentioned, there was over 3,600 pesos that were collected by Governor Anza to finance the war. So they might have paid reluctantly, but I think they paid.
Okay. You mentioned they also paid in seed. Now, did that seed go to feeding the troops while they were fighting?
No, my understanding is that seed, people in those days didn't have hard currency, so they paid in kind, and these taxes were paid in seed, and I imagine the seed was sold and turned into some sort of currency.
Okay. One of our viewers here, who's actually a Las Golondrinas volunteer, she's done a lot of research on her ancestry, and she has a few ancestors that are confirmed Daughters of the American Revolution patriots. So our question is, how common is it for native New Mexicans that maybe have roots that go back a couple of centuries? How common is it for them to have ancestors who were part of this war?
I think it's very uncommon. As I said, the war was very, very far away from New Spain and from New Mexico. So this individual who has a relative that was involved in the Revolutionary War, I think is a rare bird. I can't believe there are very many of such people.
Wow, very neat. Well, that's exciting news for you, Miss Rose. So Henry, I have a question for you. Here, especially even growing up in New Mexico, you learn about the American Revolution, the history of the United States. It's very often that France gets all the credit for being like the most influential aid that Americans had. Why is it that Spain doesn't get nearly as much credit or attention in this chapter of American history?
Yeah, that's a great question, Laura. I think that first of all, we were formally allied with the French. We were not allied with the Spaniards. And as I pointed out in the paper, the Spaniards were really prosecuting their own foreign policy interests in the New World. And France, while doing the same thing, was actually very involved in the war militarily against the British on our behalf. For example, you have the Battle of Yorktown, and you have the French fleet involved, you have the French army involved in the siege, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Continental Army and General Washington. You didn't have that kind of scenario with the Spanish troops. They were fighting the British, it's true, but they were fighting the British, again, to advance their own foreign policy interests. And it is, and I think it's for that reason that we don't often think of Spain's contribution to the revolution. But as I pointed out in the paper, that contribution was very real. There was money, there were arms, there were uniforms, there was medicine, that was all shipped to the Continental Army and General Washington. And so it's something that we forget, I think, at our peril, that Spain really did contribute a great deal to our freedom.
Excellent, thank you. Do you think that the Americans would have been as successful in this campaign against Great Britain had it not been for Spanish aid?
I think I have to think not, because, as I said in my remarks, Spain caused Great Britain to stop sending troops north to fight General Washington. They had to contend with the Spaniards. Therefore, they couldn't focus on the Americans. And that didn't happen until much later, when Florida and Pensacola fell, and the rest of the British possessions around the Gulf and Mississippi. And it was only at that time that they were then able to bring their full might against the American army. So I think it helped a lot. Yeah.
Wonderful. We might be telling a very different story in history had Spain not come
That's
into
exactly
the picture.
right. Yeah.
Well, audience out there on Facebook, if there are any more questions or comments for Henry Rivera, go ahead and put those into the comments now. Henry, I think I'm going to join you over here. Well, thank you so much, Henry. We really appreciate you coming out on this Friday afternoon to share your knowledge on Spain's contributions to the American Revolution. I know I learned a lot of new information. I hope our audience did too, as we said, Spain doesn't often get the recognition that it deserves in this chapter of American history, so that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And thank you again so much for your dedicated service on our board here at El Rancho de las Golondrinas, and for always offering to share your knowledge on these little talks.
Sure, my pleasure.
And thank you all, our wonderful viewers. Thank you for your continued support. Thank you for logging in with us here on these sometimes windy afternoons here at El Rancho de las Golondrinas. Remember that we come to you about every week, every couple of weeks. Our next Golondrinas live session will be on Friday, October 2nd at 5 o'clock. We're going to be featuring one of Las Golondrinas' volunteers, Julia Gomez, and she's going to share a little bit about the history of remedios, old historic New Mexican remedies. As we come into the autumn and winter months here, that's some good information that we're going to want to have. Remember that these videos stay on our Facebook. You can also view them if you have friends or family that are interested in learning a little bit more about New Mexican history and they don't have a Facebook. They can go to our YouTube channel. They just have to go to youtube.com and type in Las Golondrinas channel. Don't type in the name because that'll take you to videos about us. So go ahead and type in Las Golondrinas channel and you'll see the series of Golondrinas live sessions that we've already completed. Check with us right back here on Facebook and our Instagram, both at SF Golondrinas, for information on more of these videos, as well as more about what's going on here at the ranch. For those of you that aren't aware, we were excited to be able to open up, at least to limited capacity, a couple of weeks ago. So go ahead and go to our website. All the information is there. You have to have pre-reserved tickets, but all of that can be purchased directly through our website. So remember, your adventure starts at golondrinas.org. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.